Welcome, everybody, back to another one of our 8-part series of CRIN podcasts for COP, and that's the Clean Resource Innovation Network at the Conference of the Parties 28 in Dubai. And these podcasts have been part of a process that we want to tell the story of how Canada and its various stakeholders in the energy ecosystem collaborate and try and accelerate our energy transition aspirations. And a big part of that process is the new partnerships and the new frontiers of partnerships we're shaping with our Indigenous partners, our First Nation communities. And there's no better spokesman to tell that story than my good friend Stephen Buffalo, who is the CEO of the Indian Resource Council. And the Indian Resource Council is an incredibly important actor on our energy transition stage. And history will tell us a story. It's because of the leadership of individuals like Stephen Buffalo and others that we were able to accelerate a very inclusive transition. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Glad to be here.
Good. You know, I think about IRC a lot, and I think about, yes, that's one of our many acronyms in our industry. But when I think past the acronym, and I think about the communities, I think it's now more than 140 communities that IRC represents in terms of acting as an agent of interest. Tell us about the IRC model, and tell us, since you've been there, you know, the changes you've seen, and we'll use that to sort of move to a conversation about how it interfaces with the federal government through Indian Oil and Gas Commission.
Okay, well, Bill, you know, that's a lot of history there. The organization was started back in the early 80s, and honestly, I always take pride in mentioning my father as one of the founding members from the Samson Band, as well as one of our departed friends, Ernal Gray from Sarnia, Wamamajang First Nation in that area. And obviously the need that Joe Dion, my uncle, saw was some sort of advocacy for the First Nations that are dealing with oil and gas. As oil and gas was prevalent around our communities. Where I'm from, the Musquechees, formerly known as Hobima.
Yep.
The Bonnie Glen pool is one of the biggest world-known pools in the world. A lot of production, a lot of E&P, a lot of royalties. It was good. So, you know, the organization was founded to help First Nations not only address the industry in and around them, but also to address the regulatory stuff and to ensure that royalties and stuff like that are collected properly. They formed what was called the Indian Oil and Gas Act. Hence, you know, you fast forward it a little bit, it created the Indian Oil and Gas Canada. Back in the day, the First Nations here in regards to oil and gas dealt with two people, and they're under the Department of Indian Minerals West.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this special operating agency under Indian Affairs, which is now Indigenous Services Canada, has been our regulator. So anything that happens on First Nation land, they're the regulator, and they approve the leases and they collect the royalties. You know, there's a lot of environmental concern. The pools aren't quite there on reserve. And it's been challenging for industry to see some of First Nation land as an attractive investment. And a lot of it is the upfront regulatory that they have to go through. But, you know, it has been very beneficial for First Nations that have been partaking in it. Born from it were oil companies that were developed from the First Nations. Service industry, you know, we had people that used to work on the rigs, had their own businesses for water trucks, tanker trucks. You know, it spawned a lot of work and benefit to First Nations.
One of the things I always marvel about at IRC is the quality of your team that sort of carries out the day-to-day and all the things that IRC is doing. So tell me about people like Winona Lafreniere and the impact she's making on the organization under your leadership.
Sure, Bill. Winona is our new director of the National Energy Business Center of Excellence, which is our capacity building division.
Absolutely. But is it fair to say, before we move into the COP discussions and CRIN and all those other things, that Winona's initiative around Phase 2 environmental is an offshoot of the proving up of that ability to take ownership and deliver against a promise?
Absolutely. You know, people that are in the field of reclamation know that there's a Phase 2 in environmental that needs to be done. And quite honestly, you know, we have not only traditional knowledge from a lot of our elders that are still with us, are able to share. Some of these young men and women have grasped that knowledge and now taken it to a technical side and bring in what can be done to make the land back to what it used to be. You know, the well might be plugged and covered up with dirt 6 feet, 8 feet below the ground, but at least we can use that land for something now. To me, I think that's true reclamation in that regard.
So give us a few details on what I'll call the Winona Initiative, because I love her entrepreneurship and her innovative thinking. But this is fundamentally saying to the folks who will come through the program is we're going to teach you some pretty cool things with drones and impact assessment and a whole different range of skill sets.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely you'll have some environmental science. You'll have some tickets that you can be in certain areas of an oil field. And the cool part is definitely you get what's called like a pilot's license through drone training. And really the drone is designed to circulate and fly around an area where it'll help detect methane without being close by the site. So I think it's a very safe, very positive way. It's bringing, some of the cool technology to the forefront. And then once you take some of the traditional knowledge with that, then I think who knows what we can accomplish in getting this all done.
So when you think about, we talked before off camera about AIOC.
Yep.
And I think the Alberta government was very forward thinking about creating the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. You're involved in that. They had some great news just recently in terms of the way that they're going to invest and the caps on investment. So give us a quick riff on that, because that's a global story to be told.
Oh, for sure. Honestly, again, I'll go back to my good friend Jason Kenney. At the time he was premier, and he did phone me and told me about this idea. And I was like, wow. My head was spinning after that. And fortunate, I applied to be on the board, and I was able to be one of the founding board members. The intention at the time when he was premier was for nations to participate on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the expansion. And despite where the project was at that time, there was still time to get things in order. But other projects were going on. So it was designed to give the ability of First Nations that had no investment capital, that had nothing to lever, to be an investment. And the Alberta government would provide a Alberta loan guarantee for their participation. So it made a lot of sense, and you had people involved that really created unique financing to make sure it happened. Taking it to the bond market, for example.
Yep, absolutely.
And it worked. The true test before AIOC was at East Tank Farm in Fort McMurray.
And when we think about this sort of international lens that sits on Canada, and you've been an active player in this whole idea of the Trans Mountain expansion being either hugely equity owned or almost entirely owned by First Nations communities that are not only living along the pipeline, but whose interest in it, they may be in Saskatchewan, but they have an interest in it. How do you think we might resolve the over budget runs and the cost of tolls and all that kind of thing? What does that navigation look like? So 10 years from now, if you and I were sitting back, we say, well, isn't that cool, that whole thing? We got egress to global markets for our part because we had this great ownership structure.
It's going to set a different tone, and it's going to be very positive for a lot of communities that are part of it. There is some fear-mongering on what happens to pipelines. And quite honestly, the regulations in Canada are world-class. And First Nations can be a part of those regulations, monitoring these pipelines, looking for methane leaks. And again, back to the drone pilot license, that can help with that. But, like I said, once they come up with an opportunity, a deal or some sort, who's going to sell what to who, it's going to be trend-setting. It's life-changing for sure, all of the bitumen that's going through that pipeline.
So would it be, I'm pretty Don Quixote-like in terms of the windmills I tilt at, but I was saying to somebody the other day, if the feds get the equity ownership right, the Trans Mountain Pipeline can be this phenomenal laboratory of Indigenous knowledge and science and Western knowledge and science in action. So what do you think about that potential? And talk about what the impact of equity ownership means to actually on-the-ground communities and how they're trying to stand up on their own, right?
Well, Bill, you heard me say the Indian Affairs dependency is huge, and it's just not enough. So having these creative opportunities, especially if it's in your backyard, especially you can touch it, I think it's a game changer. And again, our people are very cognizant of the environment. And the odd time, the developers and the government will listen to our concerns and make adjustments to kind of hear that. And, I think that door is open tremendously. You're seeing partnerships with service companies and oil companies. You're seeing partnerships with pipeline companies, with First Nations. First Nations have spurred on some entrepreneurship and doing their own business, be it services in what area. There's huge ripple effects, as just being an owner. The hard thing to measure is the bureaucracy and the politics that comes with this.
See, the Canadian Energy Association, it has many layers of value, but one of them is it's one of the few, and I tell all the governors and the board of this all the time, you're one of the few acronyms in our industry that actually represents the totality of the ecosystem, right?
Great.
And you have no interest beyond a healthy and vibrant energy economy that's in a constant state of improvement. I go, that sounds really hokey.
Yeah.
But CIA is an acronym and CRIN is an acronym.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in our industry, Stephen, here, and we forget about the power of the acronym. It's the connective tissue that holds our industry together.
Yeah.
So, when we think about messages that can be delivered at COP, one of the things is, here's our alphabet soup of actors, right? Yeah, and IRC is one of them. There's a multiplicity of them. But when you know them, you realize that they hold stuff together.
Yeah, for sure. In the past, not too long ago, every company downtown here was looking for this manual, this book. How do you make a relationship with a First Nation community? And both of these organizations I think are doing a great job opening the door and really stepping outside of their boxes and comfort level to create relationship. Hence, you see what happened with Steve Mason and Riti and Siksiga. That's amazing. You can't build that relationship overnight. It takes some time. I always tell a kind of a crazy story. It's like, we need more Himmelkays in the world. Himmelkays, when I was growing up, was the lawyer, the consultant, or the nice accountant that came in our community, and everyone knew him. So when this guy comes through the door in the council chambers and the elder says, "Hey, who's the white guy?" The chief will say, "Hey, Himmelkay." So more and more of these people are needed.
That's a wonderful piece of sort of important anecdotal history, but really a history that's sort of empirical in it. So on that, one of the things that always has fascinated me, and I would sort of nuance your point about one of the things really important is we understand and we don't universalize every First Nation community, right, in terms of understanding their history. But what do First Nations and Indigenous communities and Métis communities and Inuit, I think we have a lot to learn from a governance perspective.
Yeah.
And this beautiful fusion of thinking about energy transition through joint governance models.
To participate in this industry, you do need some corporate governance. But back home, there is some traditional governance. For example, we always, in my community, there's the elders committee. They direct the leadership of our community on certain issues. In some areas in BC, they still have the hereditary chieftainship. It's really what the community wants. But democratically, I know a lot of our communities have adopted the election of a leader, but they're still maintaining some of the traditions and cultural practices, acknowledging God, the creator, when we meet downtown here, for example, non-Indigenous may now understand what it means to present tobacco when talking to an Indigenous leader. That says a lot.
Absolutely.
I recently helped one of CR members. He had a meeting up in northern Saskatchewan, and he asked me, "What do I bring?" And he was surprised to see the reception after he presented the gifts of a blanket and tobacco, and then things were kind of positive moving that way. So it's those things combined with traditional spirituality and some of the practices combined with Robert's Rule of Order. I'm going to tell you a story. So one of my board members is Chief Henry Lewis.
Yes.
And he was talking about this whole thing on climate change. And this teaching came from older people before him. And he was told as a young man, our breath is the food for this tree, because this poplar tree is a very, very important piece in our King Lodge, the Sundance, so that our breath feeds it. They didn't know anything that it's carbon dioxide. It's just...
Absolutely.
It was just the connection to the earth. But, that traditional knowledge, is there science behind it? You can dissect the science,
You absolutely can, right? When you think about even here in Western Canada, that understanding of vegetation growth on the buffalo hunt and the burning of the grasslands, like that's science, right?
Yeah.
I remember saying to some young folks, I said, Indigenous communities were the first transportation engineers.
Yeah.
They understood the properties of bitumen long before non-Indigenous communities, right?
The bitumen back in the day, and then it turned into condensate, especially when it came by the riverbeds,
absolutely,
was a medicine for us. When you say it in Fort McMurray, is that, the bitumen's leaking in the river. People freak out that it's a bad thing. It's like, no, that's natural formation. That's it's being pushed to the surface. Like, you can actually drive by you'll see the riverbed black.
It strikes me what you're saying there fundamentally, it's sort of Mother Nature's pharmacy in many ways and utility. It was the duct tape of the past when you're patching the transportation systems. But so as we close, what message on behalf of Alberta and behalf of Canada would you be able to think would be an appropriate one for the world to look at how we do things here and how we struggle to do things well?
Yeah.
We don't necessarily always get it perfect, but what message would you leave?
Well, the fact is that we're coming together as mankind, especially like you're seeing the work we're doing here in Alberta. We're cleaning the land. We're partnering on energy projects. You're going to see some wealth generation for some nations that never had that before. And it's all through, this natural resource development. And the good part of it is utilizing the innovation and technology that are being done and combining it with some of the local traditional knowledge that might be shared with the people. And it's going to be beneficial for everybody.
So really, in a nutshell, we do have a sort of a solutions of best practices, best opportunities, but also lessons learned that we can share with the world.
Oh, yeah. I look forward to it. If everything goes green and stuff like that, it's a long journey. It's not going to happen tomorrow. The world still needs energy in all factions. It's hard to see some of the things that are happening around the world today. But at the end of the day, we're all mankind. We're all here together, and the earth is here to provide for us. If we can spiritually connect and continue to service that.
You keep giving me the fodder to ask another question. So I'm going to end on this one.
No.
Do you see a day, and when you say everything that you've just said so well and so passionately, do you see a day where IRC is thinking about total energy system opportunities in terms of CCUS on every First Nation that wants to do it, solar, wind, First Nations communities in Wood Buffalo thinking about we own that small modular reactor.
Yeah.
Do you see IRC as an agent of that change?
Yes, and and also preserving the traditional lifestyle. There's still people that live off the land and really love doing it, but there's still people that want the advancements in technologies.
But IRC strikes me as a sort of perfect agency and philosophy to be able to say small modular reactor power generation can coexist with trapping and hunting.
Absolutely.
And traditional subsistence off the land.
Absolutely. It's something to look forward to. And really, if we can find a way to make that affordable for our people, and then like right now, things aren't being affordable for our people. It's utilizing those energy forms in the right way and ensuring that we're doing the right thing in a regulatory body and ensuring nothing happens to Mother Nature. And then we'll all be very grateful for it.
I can't think of a better way to end this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Really appreciate it.